All right, picture this. You're hitting the gym, putting in the work, maybe even starting to see those gains in the mirror. But then, that little voice pops up, that voice that asks, am I even doing this right?
Hmm.
Like, what if all this effort is actually, not as effective as it could be, but maybe even like setting me up for an injury down the road?
It's funny how we can get so caught up in the excitement of a new workout program, right? We obsess over sets and reps, we chase the latest exercise trends, but sometimes we forget to step back and really think about the foundation of it all, how we're actually moving our bodies.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. We're going deep, deep, deep into a classic, a real OG in the strength training world. You can have a great training program, but it will all be largely wasted if you do not use Good Exercise Technique by Stuart McRobert. This isn't about some flashy new fitness fad. This is about the timeless principles that underpin safe and effective weight training, the kind of stuff that builds lasting results and keeps you lifting for years to come.
And what really hits you right off the bat with McRobert is his no-nonsense, straight-to-the-point style. I mean, the title itself doesn't mess around, does it? It lays it all out there. You can have the most perfectly designed workout plan, the best gear, a diet so clean it sparkles, but if your technique is sloppy, well, you're basically leaving a ton of potential on the table and potentially even, inviting trouble.
Absolutely. And for you, dear listener, for anyone who wants to cut through the noise and get straight to the real hardcore knowledge without getting lost in a sea of details, well, think of this deep dive as your cheat sheet. We're going to distill the pure, unadulterated wisdom from McRobert's work, showing you exactly why exercise technique isn't just some optional extra, some cherry on top. It's the absolute core, the foundation of everything. We're aiming for those light bulb moments, those aha, that might completely transform how you approach your next workout.
Seriously, think about it for a second. How many times have we seen people start out all gung-ho, super motivated, but then they get sidelined by those nagging aches and pains, and eventually, they just throw in the towel? McRobert argues that a huge chunk of these issues comes directly from, you guessed it, bad form. His book is all about giving you the tools to train safely, consistently, and most importantly, for the long haul.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us to the heart of what we're looking at today. Our source materials is very, very clear on this. Proper exercise technique isn't just one of the top priorities. It is the top priority, hands down. It sits above everything else, your program, your diet, even how much sleep you're getting. McRobert even points out that gyms are full of, well, let's just say opportunities for improvement when it comes to form. And as we've been saying, that's a one-way ticket to injury town population. He's all about teaching us what he calls conservative forms of the most productive exercises. Basically, how to lift weights in a way that keeps us safe, keeps us moving well, and sets us up for those sweet, sweet long-term gains. He also digs into the whole free weights versus machines debate, the importance of those big compound movements over the more isolated stuff, and some really crucial general advice for avoiding injuries.
So let's unpack those key takeaways, shall we? What's the first big undeniable point that McRobert hammers home?
He makes it crystal clear, right from the get-go, no beating around the bush. Exercise technique is king. It's not just important, it's the first thing you need to worry about, even before you start thinking about how many sets and reps you're going to do. Faulty form, he says, is a major culprit in injuries. And those injuries, well, they're the dream killers, the things that stop so many people dead in their tracks. The core promise of his book, and a really crucial insight for you, the listener, is that by mastering proper technique, you're basically investing in years of safe and consistent progress. You're building a foundation that can support you as you get stronger and fitter.
It's like, if you think about it, when your technique is off, you're essentially practicing the wrong way to move over and over and over again. And that not only limits how much progress you can make, but it also ingrains these bad habits that become harder and harder to break the longer you do them. Exactly. It's like building a house on a shaky foundation. And that leads us right into his whole conservative approach to choosing exercises. He's not trying to throw every single exercise under the sun at you. He very specifically focuses on what he calls conservative forms of exercises that have a proven track record of delivering results. He purposely avoids anything he considers risky, anything that doesn't really offer much benefit, exercises that need fancy equipment that most people don't have access to, or those that are so technically demanding that you basically need an expert coach holding your hand the whole time.
So it's about focusing on exercises that give you the biggest bang for your buck, while also being, relatively safe and accessible for the average person. What kind of exercises are we talking about here? What does he really emphasize? He's all about those exercises that give you the most payback per training minute. And those are your big compound movements. Think squats, deadlifts, bench presses, rows, overhead presses, pull-ups, the classics. These movements work multiple large muscle groups all at once, which means you can lift heavier weights overall. And that translates to more overall strength and muscle development. Focusing on these compound movements not only saves you time in the gym, but it also puts a greater demand on your body as a whole, triggering a bigger hormonal response. And those hormones, well, they're your friends when it comes to building muscle.
That makes a lot of sense. Those big compound lists are often seen as the cornerstones of any effective strength training program. But what about those smaller isolation exercises? Do they have a place in McRobert's world?
They do, but they definitely take a back seat. McRobert acknowledges that isolation exercises can be helpful, especially for building a more balanced physique and helping to prevent injuries by strengthening those smaller muscles that might not get as much direct work during the big lifts. But he's very clear that they shouldn't be the main focus of your training. He actually calls the compound exercises the spine of your program. Unless you're one of those rare individuals who seem to build muscle just by looking at a weight, and he says most people definitely aren't, you're going to be much better off focusing on those big multi-joint movements. Even those who do tend to gain muscle pretty easily, he says, would probably see even faster progress if they dialed back the isolation work and really hammered those core compound lifts.
It's like he's saying prioritize the most efficient and effective way to build a solid foundation of strength and muscle. Now, let's talk about the tools of the trade. What's McRobert's take on the whole free weights versus machines debate?
The age-old question, right? You hear it everywhere in the fitness world. McRobert presents free weights, things like barbells and dumbbells, as the traditional and ultimately the most versatile tools for building real strength. He says when you use them correctly, they're perfectly safe. But he also acknowledges that they do require a bit more skill and coordination than machines. Free weights force your body to work harder to stabilize itself, which can lead to better functional strength and even help prevent injuries in the long run.
And what about machines? What does he see as their pros and cons?
He points out that machines are super popular in commercial gyms, and they can be convenient because they often require less detailed instruction. They can potentially reduce the risk of those sudden acute injuries too, because it's harder to completely lose control of a weight stack on a machine compared to, say, dropping a heavy barbell. But, and this is a big but, he also says that the quality of machines can vary a lot. Some are excellent when used correctly, but others can be poorly designed or even potentially risky if they force your body into a movement that doesn't really suit your individual structure, things like your height or limb length.
So while machines might give the impression of being safer, they could actually contribute to chronic issues if they're not a good fit for your body.
Precisely. So while a machine might reduce the risk of, suddenly dropping a weight on yourself, McRobert argues that there's still a good chance of developing those nagging aches and pains, those chronic issues, if the machine's movement pattern isn't quite right for your body. He does make a distinction between machines that lock you into a very fixed path of motion and cable-based machines, which allow for a bit more freedom of movement. But all things considered, his primary focus in the book is on free weights. He likes their wider applicability, their versatility, and the fact that they're generally much more affordable, especially for anyone setting up a home gym.
So it sounds like he leans towards free weights as the more fundamental and adaptable option for building a solid base of strength. Now, McRobert also talks about what he calls dangerous training dogma. What's he referring to there?
He's pretty critical of the modern bodybuilding approach of trying to build a physique, as if it's a collection of a zillion tiny little muscle parts. This often leads to an insane amount of isolation exercises, and he argues that this kind of approach can actually be counterproductive for most people. It often leads to frustration, injuries, and overtraining because the sheer volume of work becomes too much to recover from. Instead, he advocates for sticking to safe forms of exercises that allow for consistent, long-term training. That consistency, he emphasizes, is absolutely key for actually achieving those physique, strength, or fitness goals you're working towards. He warns against potentially beating up your joints in pursuit of this lots of little pieces approach, saying it's unlikely to do you any favors in the long run.
It's a good reminder that slow and steady wins the race, right? Consistent, safe training with a focus on the fundamentals is likely to be more sustainable and ultimately more effective than constantly chasing every last muscle fiber with endless isolation work. Now, moving beyond exercise selection and equipment, McRobert also outlines some really crucial general factors for safe training. What are some of the key points he hits on?
This is where it gets really interesting, where he dives into the nitty-gritty of how to actually perform those exercises safely. One big one is rep speed. He says that while elite athletes, people who are already super strong and skilled, might be able to handle or even benefit from explosive training, there's absolutely no reason for the average person to take that kind of risk. He strongly recommends a slower, more controlled tempo for your reps, emphasizing that it's much safer and just as, if not more, productive for the vast majority of people.
That makes a lot of sense. Control is key in weight training, not just for minimizing injury risk, but also for making sure you're actually working the muscles effectively. What else does he emphasize?
Breathing. This is another one that people often get wrong. McRobert is adamant that you should not, under any circumstances, hold your breath while you're lifting, especially during those big, demanding movements. He says it can lead to blackouts or, at the very least, some really nasty headaches. His advice is to exhale during the concentric or lifting phase of each rep. You don't have to forcefully blow out all your air, but a controlled exhale can actually help you power through those tough parts of a lift. And during really challenging exercises, you're simply not going to be able to get enough oxygen through your nose alone. So breathing through your mouth becomes essential.
It sounds simple, but it's so important. What about the mental aspect of training? Does he touch on that at all?
Oh, absolutely. Concentration is key, he says. You got to be 100% mentally present and focused when you're training. Every single set, every single rep. No going through the motions, no zoning out, no chatting away while you're lifting. He emphasizes that even a momentary lapse in focus can lead to a breakdown in your form and significantly increase your risk of getting hurt. He also cautions against letting your ego get the better of you trying to lift weights you're not truly ready for, or pushing for just one more rep when your form is already starting to crumble.
It's a good reminder to check your ego at the door and focus on safe, mindful training. What other general factors does he emphasize?
Flexibility. This is especially crucial for exercises like squats and deadlifts. If you have tight Achilles tendons, hamstrings, inner thighs, and glutes, it's going to be really tough to perform these exercises correctly. Tight hamstrings in a squat, for example, can cause your lower back to round, which puts you at a much higher risk of injury. He really emphasizes that having good flexibility can make a huge difference in your ability to squat correctly, regardless of your natural body proportions. So flexibility isn't just something you tack on at the end of a workout. It's often a prerequisite for being able to do certain exercises safely and effectively.
Makes sense. And speaking of your connection to the ground, what does he say about footwear?
He advises against wearing shoes with really thick, spongy soles, or shoes with elevated heels. He says they won't give you a stable base for lifting. Especially during exercises like squats, deadlifts, or overhead presses, even a little bit of unwanted movement or compression in your shoes can throw off your balance and compromise your form. He recommends sturdy shoes that have good grip on the floor, decent arch support, and a pretty standard heel height. He also says to avoid training in worn-out shoes and to always make sure your laces are tied nice and tight. It's all about creating a stable and secure platform to lift from.
Now let's talk about the importance of having someone watch your back, literally.
Spotters. So crucial for exercises like squats, bench presses, and overhead presses, even when you're using dumbbells. McRobert emphasizes that spotting should always be done with two hands, in a balanced way, to prevent the weight from tipping or rotating. The spotter's job is to provide just enough assistance to help the lifter complete the rep safely when their form starts to break down. And after the set is done, the spotter should also help guide the weight back to the supports, since the lifter will likely be pretty fatigued at that point. A good spotter can be the difference between safely pushing your limits and risking a serious injury.
Absolutely. Now, what about the actual lifting motion itself? Any specific points he highlights there?
Symmetry. McRobert is a big proponent of symmetrical lifting for almost all exercises, with the obvious exception of movements that are intentionally done on one side. Lifting in a way that puts more stress on one side of your body, like favoring one leg during a squat or one arm during a bench press, can lead to imbalances and increase your risk of injury over time. It's all about making sure the load is distributed evenly throughout the movement.
Got it. So what about warming up?
He stresses the importance of warming up properly before you jump into your heavy lifting. He recommends starting with a general low-intensity warm-up for about 5 minutes something to get your heart rate up a bit and break a light sweat. Then you should do 1 to 3 lighter sets of the specific exercise you're about to do, gradually increasing the weight until you get to your working weight. He also recommends trying to stay warm between sets, especially if you're training in a cooler environment. Getting those muscles warmed up and the blood flowing is crucial for both performance and injury prevention.
Now, one of the biggest questions people have is, how much weight should I actually be lifting? What's McRobert's guidance on that?
He's a firm believer that most people use too much weight, and that inevitably leads to sacrificing good form and losing control during the exercise. When you're learning a new exercise or trying to refine your technique on one you already know, he recommends using weights that feel comfortable and manageable, not weights that are already pushing you to your absolute limit. Once your form is solid and consistent, then you can aim to use a weight that allows you to just barely complete your target reps with perfect form. And he warns that when you first switch to using really good form, you'll probably have to reduce the weight you're using compared to what you were lifting with sloppier form. But he reassures you that if you stay consistent with good technique and train with appropriate intensity, you'll eventually get back to where you were and surpass it with a much lower risk of injury.
It's a good reminder to prioritize quality over quantity and be patient with the process of building strength with proper technique. Now, he also mentions grip strength and the use of chalk.
He does. He actually encourages embracing that direct skin-on-metal contact when you're lifting weights. He recommends gradually toughening up your hands by doing some support-free training, and he advocates for using chalk as your primary grip aid, especially when you're doing back exercises and upper body pressing movements where a secure grip is essential. He even suggests incorporating specific grip strengthening exercises into your routine. A strong and reliable grip can make a big difference in your ability to perform many lifts safely and effectively.
So it's about maximizing your ability to handle the weights securely. What about seeking expert advice? When does he recommend that?
He advises considering consulting with professionals who really understand biomechanics or manipulative therapy and who are also familiar with the specific demands of weight training. He also suggests seeing a podiatrist, a foot specialist, if you have any persistent foot problems, as those can really impact your ability to perform certain exercises correctly. The key is to seek advice from someone who either already understands proper lifting technique or is willing to learn about it so they can help you identify any exercises or variations that might not be well suited to your body. It's about recognizing when you could benefit from some outside expertise to optimize your training and address any physical limitations you might have.
That makes sense. And finally, he really emphasizes the importance of proper setup before you even start lifting.
Absolutely. Before you even attempt a single rep, you need to make absolutely sure that your feet are planted firmly and securely on a non-slip surface. And you need to get yourself into the perfect starting position before you initiate the movement. It all comes back to those core principles of stability and control from the very first moment.
Now, McRobert also talks about the practicalities of adapting to superior form. When you're making a conscious effort to improve your technique, what are his key recommendations there?
He really emphasizes the importance of being patient. He points out that a lot of people, when they decide they want to improve their form, they try to immediately apply that new, better technique to the same weights they were lifting before. And when they find that they can no longer lift those weights with the improved form, they get discouraged and revert back to their old habits. To really make a lasting change, he recommends taking a temporary step back from heavy training, reduce the weight, practice the new form diligently with those lighter loads, and then gradually rebuild the weight as your technique becomes more ingrained. He says to be religiously uncompromising when it comes to using perfect form on every single rep. He warns that if you let your standards slip even a little bit, you'll quickly find yourself going back to those old, less effective patterns. It's about recognizing that learning new movement patterns takes time and dedicated effort.
So sometimes you need to take a step back to move forward more effectively in the long run. Now, McRobert specifically calls out 3 exercises, the barbell squat, the barbell deadlift, and the barbell bench press as being particularly important. Why does he highlight those 3?
He makes it very clear that he focuses on these 3 lifts, not just because they happen to be the 3 lifts contested in powerlifting competitions. He emphasizes their incredibly high potential for building overall strength and muscle for the majority of people, but only when they're done with consistently good technique. He's equally clear that for any exercise to be beneficial, it has to be done correctly. And he points out that mastering the correct groove of these foundational exercises isn't a quick or easy process. It takes time, dedicated study, and consistent practice.
So mastering these foundational movements is key for both long-term progress and injury prevention. Now, finally, McRobert touches on the often debated topic of genetic realities. What's his key message there?
He reminds us that our genetics play a huge role in determining our ultimate physical potential, and he strongly advises against comparing your progress or physique to those of people who are just genetically gifted. He even specifically mentions a bodybuilder featured in his book as an example of someone who's not genetically typical. Instead, he encourages everyone to focus on achieving their own unique potential by consistently combining good exercise technique, a solid training program, hard work, proper nutrition, and sufficient rest and recovery. And he also offers a really encouraging thought that the process of training itself, when done right, can and should be an enjoyable and rewarding experience. It's about focusing on your own personal journey and the factors that you can actually control.
So to wrap things up, what's the core message that you, the listener, should take away from this deep dive into McRobert's work?
It's simple, really. You absolutely must prioritize excellent exercise technique above everything else in your training. It's not just a minor detail. It's the bedrock, the foundation upon which all your progress and longevity in the gym will be built.
And for you, our listener, here's some actionable advice. Take an honest, critical look at your current form in the exercises you're doing. Be willing to humble yourself and reduce the weight so you can really focus on mastering the correct movements. Use tools like mirrors, cautiously of course, and ideally with video feedback, especially for those big lifts, and maybe even consider getting some feedback from a knowledgeable coach or trainer.
McRobert puts it perfectly. Without excellent form and staying free of injuries, you will never be able to achieve your physique, strength, and fitness goals. This isn't about chasing bigger numbers on the bar. It's about training smarter, protecting your body, and making sure you can keep training consistently for years to come.
And that leads us to a final thought to chew on. What seemingly small adjustments in your technique, maybe even in just one or two key exercises, could potentially unlock a whole new level of progress and protect you from injury down the line. It might be time to go back to basics, really dissect what you're doing in the gym, and truly understand the nuances of those movements you're performing.
We encourage you to really think critically about your own training. What resonated most with you today? Do you have any specific questions about exercise technique that came up during our conversation? We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions because you never know. They might even inspire future deep dives.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We sincerely hope that this exploration into the foundational principles of proper exercise technique has given you some valuable insights that you can use to enhance your fitness journey and keep you lifting safely and effectively for a lifetime.
Stay strong out there.
And lift smart.